Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another thing where I talk about things. Today, I would like to talk about Warhammer 40k, and Warhammer just a little bit, but mostly Warhammer 40k. Reason being because I played Dawn of War, and they had a recent update for the Ultimate Apocalypse mod for Dawn of War, which I've been using. The Ultimate Apocalypse mod, it's kind of cool, but also a little bit stupid. The guy who makes it is a little bit emotional. He's kind of a not that skilled of a player, so it's a very it's kind of boring during the second tier of the game, but that's because he really likes his walls and his turrets, and so you just kind of like turtle for a while. But anyway, though, that's neither here nor there. I might get into that a little bit later, but I've just been playing a lot of that, and so I was thinking about it, and I thought it might be interesting to talk about. For those who aren't familiar with Warhammer, and a lot of people are, it's a really big intellectual property. Warhammer is this sort of tabletop game. What you do is you buy these little models, and then you build an army with them. And then you go to like a store, and you find other guys that have these armies, and you say like, oh, hey, let's play a game. And they say, well, how big of a game do you want? And you say, I don't know, 2,000 points. And each of your little soldiers is worth a certain number of points. So like, say if you play guardsmen, which are like your basic little, your standard human infantry guys, they just run around with their laser guns and their soldier outfits, and they shoot at each other. Those are like 5 points, something like that. And if you wanna give them helmets so they don't get shot in the head as often, and that's 6 points, makes them 6 points, and so every soldier becomes 6 points. And so you just buy as many soldiers as you need, or tanks, or whatever else, until you use up all your points, and then you lay all that stuff down on the table, and then you shoot each other, or you simulate a little mock combat sort of thing. And it can be a lot of fun. Back when I was in college, I got really into it, and so I would meet like people, and I would then hang out with them. Afterward I might go out and get dinner, have a beer. It was a good social hobby. But an expensive social hobby, and one I eventually got out of, because they nerfed my army into the dirt, and then I didn't want to spend a whole bunch of money buying a new army, and then by the time they came out with like a new edition, it was like $70 for the book, and I thought to myself, I may as well, if I'm going to be buying books just to learn the rules, and they're going to be costing closer and closer to $100, I may as well just get out of the game. But anyway, though, it was a lot of fun for a while I was in it. And I got into it most primarily during 4th edition, which I think is a very good time to have gotten into Warhammer, because that was when the Dawn of War series first hit, the video game series. And that was also when TG on 4chan still had a really strong culture. And you could go there, and there were just tons and tons of jokes and tons of artists, lots of people who did writing and comedy and all kinds of fun things. In 2009, the janitors and the mods came in. They did these huge ban waves and just wiped out all of that fun stuff. But it wasn't just the 4chan mods that kind of sucked the life out of that whole culture. Games Workshop, the company that owns Warhammer 40k, also got really litigious, and they started like cracking down on things. But anyway, though, let's go ahead and back up, and I would like to talk kind of more from the beginning. And with that in mind, I first got into this really nerdy hobby back when I was like in middle school, when I was like 13 or 14, and Pokemon cards were a thing. I think Pokemon came out when I was like 10 years old or something like that, I'm not sure. And then it gained a little bit of momentum in the coming years. And so when I was an early teen, that's when I started collecting Pokemon cards. So, yeah, so anyway, so you could buy Pokemon cards from a lot of different places, and this became especially true as it became obvious that Pokemon cards were selling well and companies had a reason to sell them. But initially, the place to go, at least where I lived, to go buy cards was this sort of hobby shop that sold other things like Magic the Gathering cards and Warhammer armies and other things like that. And back in those days, the other thing that they used to do to keep themselves alive is they would have a bunch of computers in the back, and they would all be hooked up to a network, and that was so you could go down there and you could play on a local area network rather than online like we do these days. And you could have a big party with your friends. So if you had like 10 friends, you could get together and do like 5 versus 5 games of like a bunch of different shooters. This was how you sort of did those things back in the day, because most people were running internet too slow to actually play online. It wasn't really very feasible. So yes, that was a LAN party. It was very common, and back when I was a young teen, almost every time I would go into those stores, the back room would be packed. Like, everybody would be on the computers, and that was kind of what people went into those stores for. But anyway, though, while I was there to pick up Pokemon cards, I used to pass by all these little models on the shelf, and some of them I thought were kind of cool looking. And not a lot of them. Like, some of them were really derpy looking, because back in the day, Warhammer looked really derpy. Like, if you look up some of the old models, they were just ugly as sin. Like, terrible, you know, not really well sculpted, not very attractive looking models. But a few of them I thought were kind of cool. And one of them that I really liked was the Ravanar model. And this was actually, the Ravanar, they're like these sort of snake-like creatures that belong to an army called the Tyranids. And the Tyranids were like space bugs that traveled around from planet to planet, eating everything, and then they would move on to another planet. I didn't know what any of it was for at the time, but one day I went in, and instead of spending my allowance money on Pokemon cards, I got a space bug, and then I think that I had some paints from back when I used to paint, you know, model helicopters and like model airplanes and things like that. So I got some of those paints, and I just painted this space bug, and I thought, oh, this is kind of cool. I got this little space bug now, and I put it with my helicopters and my tanks and things like that I made. I used to like models when I was a kid. So yeah. So I didn't really get into it too much, but then once Pokemon cards started to die down, at least among my own friends, I started collecting Warhammer Fantasy, which is another branch sort of the same deal. It's owned by the same company, but they had fantasy and then sci-fi. And fantasy was what I first got into. And fantasy is funny because I don't know if, I don't remember a whole lot of it. But I believe that you needed much larger armies, and it was a little bit harder to get into. But regardless, I chose to start with fantasy, and I also chose demons. And back then, you didn't buy like a box and then have this be like an entire unit. What you had to do is they would sell like 2 guys in a package. And so you would go down to the store, I would buy 2 guys, and over the course of like several years, I gradually built up an army, where I would go down to the store, buy 2 metal guys in a package, bring it home, and then paint them. And then like a few weeks later, you know, I would get some allowance money, and I would go and I would buy 2 more guys, and then bring them home and paint them. And each one of these boxes was like, you know, $5 or $7. I can't remember how much they actually were, because they were just little guys, and you only got 2 of them. So I did this until I had, like, over the course of a year or something like that, you know, like 100 guys to actually play with and have an army. And so my friends, who also thought the models were cool, started doing the same thing. I had other friends that played, like, one of them played dwarves and one of them played dark elves. And I remember that my friend came from a very religious family. And so when his mom was asking, like, and what are these models of? And then he was like, oh, well, these are the elves, and they battled the demons. And that was how he got away with it. He was the elves that basically worshipped Satan or something like that. I don't really know the lore of Warhammer very well. But anyway, though, the proof was that I showed up with demons. And so, you know, like his mom would be like, yeah, like, do they fight demons? And then be like, yeah, here's Greg's army. You can see he's playing with all these demons from hell, and my elves are killing them. They're defeating them. So, yes, like, the elves are the good guys. They are fighting demons. And so his mom was just like, okay, fine, as long as you're killing the demons. Like, and why does Greg play demons? And it was like, well, because Greg's a filthy sinner. But I wasn't her child, so I could play demons if I wanted to play demons. But yeah, the demons were kind of cool because they were monstrous, and they had a bunch of, like, you know, they were evil. And I was a teenager. It appealed to me. Like, oh, it's so dark, so edgy, so stupid looking. So stupid, those models back then. Yeah. But anyway, though, I played that for a while, and I even got like a table made out of plywood set up down, like, and then like would stretch AstroTurf over it. Like, I had a section of AstroTurf, and this was, you know, I don't know. It wasn't really very good. It turns out AstroTurf is not really great for balancing models, so AstroTurf was not really a good idea. But I tried. I did my best. I tried to make my own little model table, and it wasn't anything too impressive. But yeah. I played this for a little while I was a teen, and then eventually kind of quit collecting Warhammer because it's an expensive hobby. I believe what happened is they changed editions, and this is how Games Workshop tends to lose me. Like, I'll be a good customer for a while, and then they'll change editions, and everything will be new, and they're like, all right, now that we've changed everything, it's time for you to go out and buy all these new models and buy all these new books and all this other stuff. And I just look at it and I go, no, it is not time for me to do all that. I'm not doing that. And then that's it. I'm out of the hobby. But anyway, though, yeah, I don't recall exactly when I got out of the Warhammer thing, when I quit collecting, you know, and painting demons. But I've got a bunch of those old demon models still lying around, and they're not like the oldest. There are some guys who've been playing the game for longer than I had, who have like very old. very, very old models. To put it in context for the people who played like the sci-fi version of the game, when I started playing, the models that were there in the store were like for example, a Carnifex was this giant, like, stupid-looking thing. It reminded me of Krang in a way from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and they had these giant, like, rounded claws. They just looked stupid. Like, they didn't look like they could actually do anything. They looked like they were going to hug the enemy to death. Like, they were just a very dumb sort of animal. They had to walk up to you and then just give you, like, a hug, and it was going to, like, I don't know, it could puncture you somehow. It didn't look like they had any practical way of doing damage, but they were supposed to be the heavy hitters for the Tyranids. But anyway, though, when I got back into the hobby, it was actually when I was in college, and I believe what sucked me back in was Dawn of War came out. And I can't recall when exactly Dawn of War came out. But I believe that what wound up happening is that I got Dawn of War, because I'm a big fan of RTS games, and I played Dawn of War for a while, and for whatever period, that just stoked my nostalgia for the whole hobby. And so I kept playing the game for a while, and eventually I just said to myself, you know what, I'm going to go to my local hobby store, and I am going to buy Warhammer figurines again. I'm going to get back into this. Like, I'm going to start playing this again. So, when I got back into that scene, I discovered a couple of things. I mean, like, I'd been role-playing a lot, and so I'd been keeping up with things. But one thing that had happened over the years is all the places that used to rely on the local area networks, the computer networks, to stay alive, they had died. Because internet had gotten better, and now everyone could play online, and there was no real point in having the local area internet, or the LAN parties. It just wasn't really a thing anymore, except for maybe for competitive tournaments, you know, like you might play StarCraft on a local area network, because that way you would get less latency and you wouldn't have any internet disconnections. Even these days, though, like Blizzard does their always online thing because they're very DRM heavy. Like they really they believe that piracy is a huge threat. So they actually eliminated the ability to do local area networks, and I think that a lot of companies are starting to do that, where you just can't play on local area internet anymore, which is actually too bad, because for the older games, there are ways to set up like sort of virtual local area networks, and if you know anything about that, I don't know, it's kind of convenient, but you don't have to use, for example, a central game server. You just have somebody host the game. And that can be better in some cases, especially if the game is old and they shut the servers down. Like, having the ability to do the local area network allows you to continue to play multiplayer in your own isolated game group. But anyway, that aside, regardless, yeah, I went down to the local game store near my college town, and then I looked around and I saw that, you know, I remembered that the very first model I ever bought was a Ravanar. And I checked it out, and I found that there were still Ravanars down there, you know, but they'd been changed. They were a little bit cooler looking now. And in fact, all the models had been updated by this time, and they were all a little bit cooler looking. So I picked up a bunch of Warhammer models, a bunch of Warhammer 40k models for the Tyranids, the space bugs, because the Ravanars belonged to the Tyranids. And I thought to myself, like, that was the first model that ever got me into this hobby. I should just embrace that, be true to that. And so I picked up the book, and this was 4th edition, is when I got into this whole thing. And like I say, 4th edition was sort of a glorious time to be into Warhammer 40k, because at any time I could go on 4chan, on TG, and there would just be tons and tons of jokes about Warhammer. And this was because the Dawn of War series had hit, and it had expanded the audience of Warhammer significantly. Like, people who didn't even play the hobby knew now about Warhammer, and could get in on the jokes and could have fun with it. And this was particularly important because Dawn of War, you know, it's a game. It was like, you know, $40, $60 or whatever, depending on when you bought it. And getting into Warhammer could cost you like thousands of dollars. Like a box of 10 guys, I believe, would cost like $35 or something like that. And you would need like 2 boxes to make one squad. So you would be spending a pretty good amount of money to get like a reasonable squad. Like, you would get like 6 squads of infantry. And so you can imagine like 12 times 30, something like that. That's like 400 and something dollars. I don't know, math. Lost the thread of my math there as I was trying to. 300 and something dollars. I don't know. There was money. It was money. If you're like in college, that was pretty much my recreational budget. And fortunate for me, though, I was living with my girlfriend at the time, and so I didn't have to, like technically speaking, I wasn't trying to impress my girlfriend into dating me more, so I just had money free. We went out on the rare occasion. She was a little bit reclusive, and I tended to be too at that time. So, just didn't get out much, and instead played Warhammer. She played The Sims too. This was separate diverging interests there. But yeah. Back then it was kind of neat, and I got really more into the culture of the whole thing. And the problem that the game always had, though, is I went down there and I started actually playing with strangers. Is the places that had survived losing the local area networks, they had wound up concentrating all the local gamers. And so you got people from all over, like every city, every town kind of had their own local game shop. As long as the town was big enough to support it at all. And so, since there was only one shop, everybody would go down to that shop. And so you would find that, like, there were guys who would play these things, like, every single Friday night, or whatever, or every single Wednesday night. And I would just go down there on a Wednesday night and just see who was there, and just get a game with, just catch a game with somebody. And so, that was actually one of the ways that I wound up making friends while I was in college. I mean, I made friends also just through classes and doing other things. I used to go to the gym. I joined the jiu-jitsu club for a while. But this is one of those hobbies that I got into where I started to meet people, and then they would just be like, yeah, we're going out for Mexican after this. Do you want to come with us? And you'd be like, yeah. And they'd be like, we're going out for beer after that. You want to come with us? And you'd be like, yeah. And you go down bar hopping with these guys that you played Warhammer with. And it was a very friendly thing. Like, I went to, a guy had his own, like, personal setup in his home once, and so he was like, I don't know, do you want to go set up? Like, I got all these personal terrain pieces I built, and, everybody just comes to the game shop if you want to check it out, and, like, I played a bunch of games with this guy, so I was like, yeah, okay, let's do that. And so, I don't know, it was a hobby. You met people. It was a good social thing. And that kept me in it for quite a long time. But what eventually happened, though, with the game, and this was funny, is that every single year, they always raised prices. Like, no matter what. Like, no matter what the economy was doing, no matter what was going on, they always raised prices. And it was so frustrating because, like, every year it would be like, oh no, what are they gonna? They're gonna raise prices. And they would raise prices exactly in line with inflation. Like, I remember people complaining about it online once, and they were just talking about it, and they were like, man, like, it's been, several years. Look at how much it used to cost then, and look at how much it costs now. And I did the math. And it was like they just raised prices with inflation, like, every single year, like without fail. Like, they just assume, like, people will pay more for these models no matter what. And this got me thinking about the hobby a lot from more of a marketing perspective, because as they started to pressure me out of the hobby financially, I started thinking a lot about what they were doing with their business model. And there's some interesting conclusions that I came to. One is that Warhammer 40k, like, if you're familiar with it because your local gaming store, if you go down there, you can actually pick up a game on almost any day with people down there at the local gaming store. Like, there's 3 stores I know of, and almost every day there would be somebody down there playing Warhammer. And all of us who were into that hobby, we all knew that was how that worked. So, like, you could play other games, like you could play War Machine, or whatever, or Warmahordes as they call it sometimes. And there was a specific day that the Warmahordes players would come down and they would play. Like, you would have to go down on that specific day. But Warhammer, at least around where I've been at, in the cities that I've lived in, Warhammer every day, anytime. You can just about go down there, and as long as it's like in the evening and everybody's off work, there's gonna be Warhammer. So, the first thing that they've got is a really strong sort of network utility. Games Workshop managed to sort of corner the market because everybody kind of has to get into Warhammer if you just want to be able to go down and pick up a game at any time. And this is important because the hobby costs a lot of money to get into. Like, I probably dropped a ridiculous amount of money into this hobby when I was in college. Like, over the years of playing, like, I played throughout college. And over those years, I probably spent a few $1,000s on Warhammer. I don't know if I've spent more than $2,000. I would probably put a hard limit on that. But $2,000 is a lot of money to spend, even over the course of, like, several years on a hobby. So people won't invest in something if they don't think that they can get something out of it. Like, if you told someone, like, yeah, I've got this really obscure tabletop game that nobody plays. Go ahead and drop $2,000 on an army, and me and you will play this game on the occasion. Almost nobody would go for that. You would need a ton of expendable income, and very few people go for that. So Warhammer has that sort of safety net. You go down there, you can just pick up a game. You have the ability to do that. Strong network utility. In fact, it's probably the #1 reason why people play Warhammer, in my opinion. Like, the setting is silly. The setting is very stupid. In fact, let me get into the setting. If you're not familiar with Warhammer, the actual setting of the game is very stupid. It's very over the top. Back in 4th edition is when they hit peak grim darkness, is what they did. And what this is there's all these different armies. Like, there's zombie robots, for example, and they're all essentially based on the Terminator from the Terminator movies. But it's like an army of Terminator robots. You know, they just walk around. They're skeletons with guns. Robot skeletons with guns. And you know, every time you see them, they're all like painted black, and they look very sad, and they have the lasers, and they march. And their whole lore is about, you know, how grim and how dark they are. And they're all waking up, and one day they're going to exterminate all life. And so you take this army down, you exterminate all life. And then, of course, you had the space bugs, which I played. And the space bugs were kind of cool. The reason why I played them was because I would go and I would look up like animals, you know, like lizards or bugs on the internet, and I would say, oh, that's a cool cut. Like, these are cool colors. Like, this is a neat camouflage pattern. And I would try to sort of copy that when I was painting my bugs. So I thought that that was a really cool element. But the bugs were the same way. I mean, it was like they go to whole planets and they descend like locusts and they eat everything. Everybody dies. So much death and destruction. And then you got like the Imperial Guard, which were like, these are the standard military of all the human worlds and everything like that. And it was just like, yes, they go out and they die by their thousands, but they fight for the Emperor, and with artillery and tanks, they blow things up and everybody dies. It's all death and sad and grim darkness of the 41st millennium. And there was only one faction, well, maybe two. Some people argued that there was a faction called the Tau, which were like these blue alien guys, and they were the only ones who ever attempted diplomacy. And they were kind of funny because they successfully performed diplomacy on a regular basis. Like, they'd run into aliens and be like, hey, how would you like to, instead of being mulched by our military machine, join us and become part of our society? And the aliens would go, yeah, I mean, what do you have to offer? And they'd be like, oh, higher technology, medicine, I don't know, socks. And the aliens would be like, socks? Oh, count us in. Yeah, that sounds fantastic. And so they would join the Tau. And so part of the threat of the Tau was that they were nice, and they would show up, and like it was like, oh, the Imperium has tried shooting all the aliens, but they can't seem to shoot them fast enough, and the Tau seem to be assimilating them. In fact, the more the Imperium shoots the aliens, the more the aliens seem to side with the Tau. So yes. So the Tau were the race that a lot of people were like, well, they don't really fit in with the setting because everyone else is insane and bloodthirsty, and the Tau were like trying to talk to people. But it actually created this sort of funny dynamic because you would see, like, the Tau Codex was full of these stories of the Tau trying to communicate with the other main factions of the story. They'd be like, yes, the Tau did previously try to communicate with the Space Orcs, but then the Space Orcs hit their diplomats with rocks. And the Tau realized that this was going nowhere. And they did try to negotiate once with the zombie skeletons, with the skeleton robots, but the skeleton robots vaporized their entire planet. And then the Tau said, well, this is not good diplomacy here from these guys either. And they tried to talk to the Imperium, and the Imperium just burned everything to the ground. And they said, well, that's not gonna work either. So there's all these stories about the Tau like trying to be diplomatic with the other races in the game, and then just getting their asses kicked as a result. So yeah, kind of a funny, like a weird sort of like here's the insanity of the universe. Here's these guys trying to be sane and just being relentlessly punished for their sanity. Aside from that, they were also like blatantly racist. Like when you got really into the lore of the whole thing, they would assimilate these other aliens, but then make them all second-class citizens. So they really weren't that great, but they were the nicest faction in the game. But there was one other faction though, that was not quite as in dire straits as everybody else, and that was the Space Marines. And that was because the Space Marines, they were the flagship guys. They'd been there since the very beginning. They'd always been kind of the main characters of the setting. And because they'd evolved, like in very early days, the game was designed kind of around these much smaller sort of things. Like they were selling these little these metal miniatures. Like remember I mentioned buying 2 metal guys from a package and then like trying to save up to where I had 100 of these metal guys. They used to do that. And so they expected the armies, the battles to be very small. So you'd buy, like here's 10 soldiers. You buy like 5 of those packs and paint each one of the soldiers, and you have an army. You have a game right there. 10 guys, a game. And the books would Space Hulk is one of the ones that a lot of people recognize. Space Hulk was a game that you played. And this was actually a board game rather than a military combat thing. And so you would take these little guys, these little Space Marines, and you would have them march around a board, and then there would be aliens that would attack them. And you know, the whole game was about the Space Marines defend themselves from aliens. And you could equip each of their guys individually with various things, and then they would try to get through, you know, and win the game based on what you gave them. So I never really played Space Hulk, but as far as I understand, that's the general gist of it. It was kind of how Warhammer, it's what Warhammer evolved from. But anyway, though, because Space Marines started off as kind of like, you know, these very small games, like these sort of skirmish level deals, where each individual guy was very important, as the game got bigger and bigger, like they introduced new armies, and these new armies were like, yes, spanning whole planets and having massive armadas and things like that. And then you got, you know, Space Marines boarding singular vessels and fighting aliens, and they have 1,000 men. 1,000 men strong, but they have really good eyesight, and so they're very good at shooting. So the Space Marines were kind of like these crack soldiers. And in the books, if you would read about what the Space Marines would do, there would be 1,000 guys in any given Space Marine chapter, and there's all this convoluted logic for why this is. The real reason is because it's just a patchwork of lore. Like, it started off and it made sense, like back in the beginning, but as things kind of got bigger and bigger, like new writers had to sort of come up with reasons. They're like, why only 1,000? Like, I don't know. Like, they didn't want to like retcon certain things, so they were just like, because their codex, the training manual says only 1,000. So they have to have only 1,000. So yeah. So you would have these like these very tiny little you know, platoons of 1,000 guys that would show up. And in the book, it would explain these 1,000 guys were such amazingly good soldiers that they could land on a planet and conquer the planet. You know, of not just 6 billion. This was like placed in the future, so there would be like, you know, 30 trillion people living on this planet, and the Space Marines would just land. And just these 1,000 guys would just take over the whole planet. So, I mean, like, if you think, like, they couldn't even assign, like, if you look at the world today and you look at how many countries there are, like, you would be spreading the Space Marines a little bit thin just trying to establish them in, like, key governmental positions. Like, it would be hard to do. But for whatever reason, you know, the lore would just say that they would do this crap. And they didn't always like rule, like they vary, they kind of waffle on that a little bit. They're like, well, yes, well, some Space Marines have a fair amount of political clout, and then and so they're never really like very committed to some of that stuff. But they always kind of talk up the Space Marines, like they're like, yes, no, everyone else needs whole armies, but the Space Marine just needs like 10 guys, and yeah. So they kind of went through that. And if you follow the Dawn of War games, of course, they all focus on the Space Marines. In the original Dawn of War, they sort of ignored that 1,000 guys only fluff, because everyone else, like, you know, you would build these armies, and you'd have, like, here's a squad of 10 guys, and here's a squad of 20 guys, and and there's shoots off lasers, and there's a tank, and you get these big armies marching around. And the Space Marines did not fit with everybody else, because their lore was stupid. So what the original Dawn of War game did is it looked at Space Marines and it was like, you know what? They build squads of 10 and 20. Like they get tanks. They march around. You know, they're gonna build like an army, like everybody else. And so as you were playing Dawn of War, if you really cared, you would notice that as you went through the game, you would easily kill more than 1,000 Space Marines throughout the game. Like there would just be bloody corpses lying on the ground. More than 1,000 Space Marines dead. You could kill more than 1,000 Space Marines in a single game. It was possible. So basically, they just didn't care about that aspect of the lore because it was stupid and kind of obstructive to army battles. But what was interesting, though, is that when they moved along to Dawn of War 2, the game developers looked at this, and I guess that Games Workshop at this point, this was the 5th edition that they moved on. 4th edition was this sweet spot for like grim darkness. Everything was grim and everything was dark. And there was one faction that was able to overcome all of it with very few resources, and that was the Space Marines. But the trouble with the Space Marines is that there was only 1,000 of them in every single chapter. So, you know, these few thousand guys were not enough, and they could get virtually nothing done. That was kind of the grimness of the whole thing, is that they were, you know, they were just like stupidly successful, but too few to really succeed. But in 5th edition, what happened was they had a guy come in named Matt Ward. And Matt Ward developed such a base of hatred when he started writing. His main army was the Ultramarines, and when he wrote the new books, what he wound up doing is he injected a lot of new fluff in there that made it sound like the Space Marines were not only like winning every war across the entire universe, but they were winning handily, and they were in total control, and everything was kind of in order wherever they were, except for when they were not following the Codex, because the Codex was invented by the Ultramarines, Matt Ward's army, and the Ultramarines were just the best faction. So I don't think it was just Matt Ward that was really pushing the Space Marines really hard, because like I say, in the Dawn of War series, Dawn of War 2 came out, and it was essentially about just the Space Marines. And they had changed the entire gameplay dynamic to revolve around the lore that was built around the Space Marines, who, because of the evolution of their faction, no longer really fit with the main, with the broader kind of army-wide thing that was going on in Warhammer. But anyway, though, like it became in 5th edition that Space Marines got really big. This was about, like, Gears of War came out, and you started to see this all over the place. Like, every video game was about these, like, grizzled Space Marines, like great big hulking super soldiers with guns, and they ran around and they shot everybody to death. And so that got to be very popular in that time frame. And so Games Workshop capitalized on the popularity of that Space Marine thing. And they stopped updating their other armies, and they just started releasing Space Marine codexes and Space Marine variants. Like, they redid the rules, and then instead of updating other armies, they just released Space Marines. And the armies that they did update, minus a couple of factions, mostly got screwed. Like, they were all substantially worse than the Space Marines. And I remember we actually lost some gamers, and including myself, to be honest, in 5th edition, because we would have guys who would show up, and their armies were just getting weaker and weaker to Space Marines. Like, every new flavor of Space Marines that came out was a little bit stronger than the last, because the new codex had to sell, and nobody would buy new Space Marines if they weren't better than old Space Marines. So, starting off, Space Marines were pretty solid, and then the new Space Marines were stronger, and then the new Space Marines were even stronger, and then came out the 4th brand of Space Marines who were even stronger. They had psychic powers and giant lasers, and it just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And so I remember a guy, just like sitting down with his like the original Space Marines that they first released, and he pitted them against a much, the higher up Space Marines that had been released later. And he'd built what he thought was an anti-Space Marine list, given the book that was down here on the lower tier. And he lost to the army it was just like a fluffy, like casually thrown together, like tossed salad of like, I like these units. And this tossed salad army crushed his like tailor-made I'm killing Space Marines army. And so he just threw up his hands and he goes like, I can't play this game anymore. And I never saw him around the game shop anymore after that. Like, he just gave up on Warhammer 40k. He was like, I'm sick. Like, he goes, I can't be asked to buy a new codex and a new like squad of Space Marines every single time they release a new codex. Like, this is just not gonna fly. I actually got out of the game when they updated the Tyranid Codex. This was the same thing as they released the space bugs. And suddenly, like in my codex, I was reading, like in the previous codex, I was reading about all this stuff. It was like all these other perspectives of like, oh God, the Tyranids, they're coming and they're killing everything. They're eating everybody. We don't know how to stop them. Help us. And then the new codex was like, oh, the Tyranids came and we stomped them completely flat. Like, they came and they attacked the Space Marines, and the Space Marines melted all their stupid faces, because they are stupid bugs, and their tactical abilities pales in comparison to the Space Marines. And then they attacked the Tau, and the Tau were able to out-adapt them, and the Tau were very fast and very maneuverable, and they ran around with a giant dildo and just shoved it right up the butt of the Tyranid queen bug. And then she exploded. Her brain just, boom, blew out of her head. And it was actually a super disappointing codex. They nerfed virtually everything, and it wound up being that it got really hard to play. And I wound up having a lot of success with an army that a lot of people would have not recommended. It wound up just being like, I relied a lot. There was a unit called Biovores who just shot these long-range mines, and they explode. They had a large blast radius. It was a very good anti-infantry thing. But what I wound up doing, like everyone's conventional wisdom on Tyranids, was they were like, oh yeah, no, they're space bugs. They're supposed to run up to the enemy and then devour them, like you leap on them and you devour them. But I looked in the codex, and what had happened was the guy who wrote that codex, he'd played another army that was very infantry heavy. And this particular army was fairly vulnerable to Tyranids in the previous edition, because they were sort of soft and sort of squishy. When Tyranids tackled them, their guys would die, and the only thing that was protecting them from the Tyranids was their armor, you know, their tanks. Like, they had to get a bunch of tanks, and they had to shell the Tyranids, and if the Tyranids got to the front lines, then it was kind of all over for this guy's faction. So what he did is he nerfed a lot of the melee elements so that, you know, getting up in their face was not as beneficial, and then he kind of wrote a lot of their long-range stuff to be more, it was based a little bit more on, like, artillery mentality and stuff like that. So I found out that if you just took a bunch of artillery bugs, you know, with these large blast weapons and things like that, and then you mixed in a bunch of anti-armor bugs that were specifically designed to kill tanks, then if you formed this sort of castle formation and didn't move your damn army all game, which was really boring, then that was actually getting me a lot more success than playing the game in the way that a lot of people conventionally thought the bugs were supposed to be played. And so I got kind of bored playing the army. I found that trying to make a more interesting and more moving sort of list was not working. And then a new edition came out, and it was like $70 for a new book, and I sort of got out of it. But yes, on the whole, Warhammer, it's an interesting sort of deal. 5th edition is also when Games Workshop started to get really litigious, though. This was the other thing, is that, like I say, the 4chan mods wiping out all the artists was a big deal. But another thing that started to happen was that people started to get cease and desist orders from Games Workshop. Like, there was one weird case that I read about where somebody had released a book called Spots the Space Marine. And this book, Spots the Space Marine, was like just about a Marine in space. And Space Marine is like a term that's been around for a long time, but what Games Workshop was doing is I think they had trademarked the word Space Marine, where they tried to put a copyright on it. And what they were doing is they were trying to defend the trademark to make it seem like they actually owned the phrase. Like they wanted the courts to recognize that they owned Space Marine somehow, that people broadly recognized Space Marine as something that only Games Workshop owned. So, like, for example, they came after somebody who they made a book they called Spots the Space Marine, and so they came after this person. They took him down. They were like, you can't use Space Marine, that's illegal. And so they went around doing this, and they started suing people who were making like modifications to the models. There was a place called Chapter House Studios, and what they were doing is they were making like pauldrons and guns and things like that, and they were just saying like, yeah, so this is in the codex, but you actually can't buy these models from Games Workshop, so we make these models, and then you can have them in your armies. And some of them were just variants of things that Games Workshop already did, and it was kind of a weird legal case because I don't know, it's like if you look at, like, for example, you buy a car, like you buy a Ford or something like that, like you can buy decals for a Ford, you know, like you'd slap decals on your car, it's your car, you have the right of first sale, you know, you can do this and you can do that. So what these guys were doing is they were selling under the assumption that they were making mods for a pre-existing IP. It was like you bought a bolter or whatever, like you bought a gun, and you would put this on the models that you already bought, and it would modify your model, you know, like you'd have it more, like you'd say like, oh, I got a combi gun, and the combi guns, you can't buy them from Games Workshop, but you can buy them from Chapter House Studios. And so this was what Chapter House Studios was operating under the assumption of. Games Workshop disagreed. Games Workshop felt that what they were doing was illegal, and because they were suing everybody, they sued Chapter House Studios. And what wound up happening was that Games Workshop lost control of a bunch of their intellectual property, because when they got to court, the guys came out and they were like, yeah, like Games Workshop doesn't make these things, and we're making them, you know, to modify your guys. And the court said, yeah, you know what, just because Games Workshop says, like, they put this on paper, there was some stuff, like, you know, I don't know, like I've heard that the ruling was, you know, debatable, you could argue with it, but they lost the intellectual rights to a bunch of things that they were trying to claim intellectual rights to, which, of course, based on the fact that they were trying to claim generic phrases like Space Marine, is not too big of a surprise. But then what they turned around and did is they had released one codex where they were like, yes, no, all of these things are in the codex. Like, you can get these special guns, or you can get this special hero. And they weren't releasing models for any of these special guns or for the special hero. They expected players to kind of make their own. You know, it was supposed to be a creative hobby. You would get some green stuff and, you know, like some modeling putty and some wire and some whatever, and you would sculpt your own guns or your own units. But then after they lost their lawsuit with Chapter House Studios, they removed all the stuff that they weren't already making. And they were just like, yes, this doesn't exist anymore. So this was funny because it had the effect of like people had been making these models and these guns and these things like this. And when they released the new codexes, all these things were suddenly gone. And so if you'd gone through all the trouble to sit down and sculpt out your own like weapons and your own models and stuff like that, it was all no longer in the game. It was just stricken from the game. And so you had to kind of like look at this and just be like, yeah, like when you got to the game store, they'd be like, what is that guy? What is he holding? And you'd be like, not what it looks like, because it's not in the game anymore. And that was a little bit frustrating. But yeah. Anyway, I guess to wrap up, I was saying like I've been playing the Dawn of War. I've been playing Dawn of War Soulstorm modded with the Ultimate Apocalypse mod. And it kind of brings back, there's just so much bombast and so much stupidity. And this Ultimate Apocalypse mod, it's a lot of fun and it's a lot of spectacle. But it's interesting because the guy who runs it, he's sort of like I say, he kind of wants turtling to be a viable strategy. And very few RTS games really promote that sort of thing because it makes games drag on. They become very stale, very boring. You spend a lot of time like in a Cold War situation, just like building up your walls and like looking at each other over the walls and, you know, trying to wait like, well, you come over here. And you'll be like, no, all my guys will be shot. You come over here. He's like, oh, no, I'm not coming over there. You got too many turrets over there. You know, so that sort of thing. But yeah, it's worth looking at that Ultimate Apocalypse mod because Dawn of War 2 came out. And like I mentioned, they tried to change the perspective so that the Space Marine lore fit. And what they wound up doing is they made it to where every army basically got their arms tied behind their legs, except for this, they got their arms tied behind their back, and I don't know, maybe the legs tied too. And they said like, yes, Space Marines, you may deploy 10 soldiers. And then, like, you get all these other armies, and, like they would have the Tyranids in Dawn of War 2. And the Tyranid lore, it's like, yes, thousands upon thousands, innumerable bugs descend on the planet. And they would be like, yes, you may have 20 bugs. You get 20 of them. And so that would be how you'd play. Like, you'd be like, oh, I fight these 10 Space Marines with my 20 bugs. My numerable, and 20 bugs. Innumerable, 20 bugs. Same deal, like they had like space orcs, and that was another one that was like, yes, the orcs come by their thousands. And then it was like, you get 15 orcs. 15 of the orcs come. That was all you got. And it was all just to make the Space Marines work, which was really terrible. Like, the Space Marines, in my opinion, they are the worst faction for 40k. I mean, like, they're cool. Like, they're cool in this stupid way that Warhammer is cool. And I don't, like, when I say they're the worst faction, I don't mean, like, people shouldn't play them, or that you shouldn't enjoy them, or that you should look at them and be like, oh, they're stupid. I mean, they're lore-wise the stupidest faction. They're lore-wise the worst faction for the game, because their lore makes so little sense, and they impose these absurd, ludicrous restrictions on, like, designing things. I mean, like, the bigger your games get, like, the larger the armies get, the less sense it makes for you to deploy quite so many Space Marines. Like, it's like, yeah, this is 100 guys. This is like a tenth of the Space Marines, and I'm playing this game, and they're just dying on the battlefield. One thing that I have seen in the original Dawn of War is I've seen it modded to where Space Marines are reflecting fluff, and it was actually really funny and also really broken. What it was is that you had to build like one Space Marine. Like, you would build your building for building Space Marines. Instead of having a squad of guys that would come out and then like go and battle with everybody like normal, you would just get one Space Marine. And he would have like 1 billion health. And it was really funny because you just run around, you just be like, dispatch this one Space Marine to this enemy's base. And the one Space Marine by himself would defeat like 40 soldiers. So, yeah, lore-friendly Space Marines. Absolutely terrible for Warhammer 40k. By all means, I think that that whole like only 1,000 guys fluff, that is just the dumbest fluff. But a lot of 40k fluff is dumb. If you get too hung up about how dumb it is, I mean, it's always been dumb. There was a period, like I say, in 5th edition, there were some codex writers who crossed the line of dumb so far that they actually couldn't come back and people wouldn't forgive them. But it's always been very, very dumb. So anyway, Warhammer 40k, quite a lot to say on it. You know, it was weird. It was fun. Way too expensive. I'll probably never get back into it. I don't have the cash or the time to invest into that hobby again. But it was there when I was in college. So that'll be it for today. Thanks for joining me, everybody. I will catch you all next time.